So, what do you think? How heavily are the classic Star Wars films shaped by Buddhist and Taoist philosophy? So, I've been slowly working through the 2005 title Star Wars and Philosophy, and I'm really enjoying part one, which is about the philosophical messages of Star Wars. The third chapter in that sequence seems to me to have really hit the nail on the head more than any of the other three, and this is Chapter 3, The Far East of Star Wars. So, the question I've been asking through each of these videos is something to the effect of, what kinds of real-life beliefs or ideas are playing out through that classic Star Wars saga? And then for today, that question is going to be, okay, how about Buddhism and Taoism? How much do they shape the storytelling and messaging of Star Wars? So, while thinking about that question, I'm going to provide a quick summary and short review of Chapter 3, The Far East of Star Wars. But before we get to that, who wrote this chapter? Now, since this book is an essay compilation, each chapter is a complete essay written by a separate author, and this particular essay was written by Dr. Walter Robinson. So, who's that? So I tried Googling Dr. Robinson online, and I couldn't find a lot of info because I just kept getting other Walters and other Robinsons. His bio page on the Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis website is a dead link. So I'm guessing he's either recently passed away or recently retired and stepped out of the public eye. But I was able to find 3 web pages that did make reference to this particular Dr. Walter Robinson. Google Books listed one book that he published back in 2012. ResearchGate has one of his academic articles. And on the more fun side, he is listed on ratemyprofessors.com, where you can hear what his students thought of him as a professor. So, according to Google Books, Walter Robinson earned a PhD in philosophy and religion from the California Institute of Integral Studies, and he teaches philosophy at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. His areas of scholarship are East Asian and American Indian philosophies, which form the basis of his critique of Western thought, end quote. The particular book that's listed there is his 2012 publication, Primal Way and the Pathology of Civilization, in which he, quote, presents a cross-cultural exploration of the deepest issues facing mankind. Using the foundation of philosophical Taoism, a normative system of understanding, Robinson evaluates society's state of health. Primal Way and the Pathology of Civilization shows that society must heal, and it can be accomplished through the primal way. All right, and then what was it like to sit through one of Dr. Robinson's classes? Just for fun, let's take a look at his ratemyprofessor.com reviews from the mid-2010s. Dr. Robinson gives an interesting class, teaching by lecturing mostly, with stories about the lives of philosophers discussed and discussions on the concepts. He has a very deep knowledge about Chinese and Native American philosophy and culture, and pairs that with crass humor and Star Trek and Star Wars. Some may get offended, but I found him hilarious. Professor Robinson was a fairly decent instructor. It's very easy to achieve an A if you follow his instructions. He is left of center politically speaking, and will make this known to you throughout your discussion of ethical issues by questioning the conservative stances and going easy on more liberal stances. Recommended if you must take ethics. This guy liked him. If you want an easy A, take this class. If you're easily disturbed by comments that may or may not offend you, don't take it. The guy is very sporadic and says his mind, doesn't care about you with respect to your values, but does care about your grade. So basically, as a person, he doesn't care about you. As a student, he wants you with an A. Professor is competent in the subject he teaches. He would be an enjoyable teacher if he didn't habitually use sexual situations as examples when explaining an ethical concept. The class only requires journals for each class meeting and 2 papers. This was a fairly easy class, but I would not take a class with this professor again. Truly an enjoyable professor if you're willing to open your mind to new ideas. This is the class for you. He brings a lot of colorful stories to each class and is willing to be very honest about what he knows and what he does not know. Excellent professor with a deep knowledge of Chinese philosophy, especially Buddhism. He somehow manages to be both highly irreverent and very sincere during his lectures. 2 take-home 6-page essay exams and a 15 to 20-page paper are required. Grading seems neither too easy nor too hard. He always says, your mental health is more important than your GPA. Professor was kind of crazy and made a lot of dirty comments in class, which made it awkward. Only 2 papers due, no attendance or quizzes, which made it easy. The first was a 6-page and the second was a 12-page, an additional 6 to the already first 6 pages written. Dr. Robinson is probably one of the most unusual philosophy professors you will encounter at IUPUI. Unlike most academic professors, he is not an atheist or materialist and believes that religion merits a certain degree of respect. He is also perhaps the only professor who will spend significant time on Eastern philosophy. And that's the last one. All right, this sounds like an interesting guy. So I guess that's Dr. Robinson, at least according to certain students who put up reviews. So let's take a look at what he thinks about Buddhist and Taoist concepts within classic Star Wars. So he starts off by talking about the Force as Qi, and he makes the observation that, quote, Eastern philosophy, most especially philosophical Taoism and Zen Buddhism, plays a major role in the Star Wars mythology. He goes on and talks about the historical origins of Zen and Kung Fu coming out of a Buddhist-Taoist synthesis. And then he goes back to the origin of Buddhism and discusses the core teachings of Buddhism, that we as humans experience suffering due to our ignorance of reality, but by means of enlightenment, quote, one comes to know reality and thus liberation from the chains of karma, end quote. He explains that the character of Yoda in particular, quote, was created with Zen in mind. But he explains this wasn't supposed to be a sectarian kind of thing. Lucas was heavily influenced by the popular mythologist Joseph Campbell. Robinson says, Lucas learned from Joseph Campbell that underlying religious mythologies are archetypal patterns which reflect universal truth. End quote. He later adds, quote, Star Wars mythology is an intentional expression of archetypal truth. And then he adds that as part of that larger vision, quote, Yoda is intended to be a motif for universal wisdom. So Robinson is suggesting that Yoda in particular is clearly a Zen portrait, but he's a Zen portrait intended to represent archetypal wisdom in a Joseph Campbell mythological kind of way. He then transitions to a discussion of Taoism, which is relevant since Zen philosophy emerged as a synthesis of Buddhism with Taoism. He talks about yin and yang. He says Taoism teaches that qi is manifested as yin and yang, the light and the dark, and that one must harmonize with this energy, which requires balance. He explains that the word Tao means way, and explains that the philosophy of Tao is about the way of nature. He says the yin-yang symbol is properly called the emblem of Tai Chi, which literally means supreme ultimate, and it symbolizes the interdependence of opposites. And then what about morality? So he explains that in Taoist thought, there is neither absolute good nor absolute evil, but rather good and evil are relative conditions of one another. And then as he expands on that, he makes note of Star Wars characters using the phrase to bring balance to the Force. And he explains that from a Taoist point of view, it is not possible to have the light without also having the darkness. Or in the language of Star Wars, one cannot exist without the dark side being ever present. So in a sense, you could think of the events of the prequel trilogy as being a time when the Force was out of balance by having too much good, resulting in stuff like carelessness and overconfidence among the Jedi, etc., and then eventually leading to the rise of complete Sith domination. Still on the topic of morality, he takes us back to when Yoda was teaching Luke to distinguish and to recognize the dark side through his intuitions. Yoda said, "You will know the difference, quote, when you are calm, at peace, passive." A little bit later on, Robinson explains that according to Buddhist psychology, there are 3 poisons which produce the karma of suffering. Attraction, kind of like desire, repulsion, which would include things like fear and hate, and then he says ignorance, which is particularly ignorance of the interconnectedness of all things in the universe. So he explains how the fall of Anakin illustrates all 3, because suffering in that context is caused by attraction, which in this case is Anakin's attachment to his mother. And it's related to repulsion, which in this case is his resultant fear and hatred of others because of his attachment to his mother. And then ignorance, which in this case is related to his disconnectedness from those around him. He's willing to kill all the Sand people. He's in a state of conflict with the various Jedi and all this kind of stuff. And then his inability to manage the suffering caused by those 3 poisons results in him gradually descending to the dark side. So Robinson explains that this concept of interconnectedness, because ignorance is ignorance basically of interconnectedness, so this concept of interconnectedness relates to the idea of the illusion of the self. Our ignorance refers to our misguided belief in self as distinct and autonomous. And then fear and suffering at root are, quote, the clinging of the ego, of not realizing the oneness of life, end quote. He explains that the Buddha taught that freedom from suffering, quote, is the letting go of clinging to the ego, end quote. A related concept that comes out in these Star Wars films is the Taoist concept of Wu Wei, or no action, which basically refers to effortless action or egoless spontaneity. Robinson explains, when Yoda says to be passive, he does not intend for Luke to become inactive, for the Force is ever in motion, like water flowing in a river, passively in action without effort. Then he goes on to explain that this is an important aspect of the Japanese martial art of Aikido, which strongly influences the descriptions of Jedi fighting technique in the films. And then at this point in the chapter, Robinson tells about an order of Buddhist warrior monks called the Huarang, which had a lot in common with the Jedi. He talks about a similar Japanese order called the Sohei. He explains that the Sohei ended up being wiped out by the samurai, after which they went into hiding and ended up teaching their skills to others, including the samurai. So the samurai ended up being the big influence on the portrayal of the Jedi in Star Wars. A couple of highlights from that section. He says, the word samurai means to serve. It was the role of the samurai to serve the good of the nation with honor and loyalty to the emperor. Later he says, the samurai had a strict code of conduct known as Bushido, which means the way of the warrior. He also says the name Jedi is derived from the samurai era of swordsmen called Jedi Geki. And then he says the Jedi's kimono-style dress is loosely based on samurai clothing with the addition of the medieval hood to give a more monkish motif. And he talks about how swordplay techniques in the films are based on kendo and kung fu. And he also talks about the role of the Zen approach of no-mind mindfulness as part of swordsmanship. So he notes how in Star Wars, quote, when Obi-Wan tells Luke to let go of his conscious self and act on instinct, he's essentially advising to let go of the divided delusional mind and go with the original mind, which is the mind unconscious of itself. As the Zen master Takuan Soho put it, a mind unconscious of itself is a mind that is not at all disturbed by affects of any kind. The mind moves from one object to another, flowing like a stream of water, filling every possible corner. End quote. So he goes on to talk about intuitive action, Aikido, and Yoda's try not, the part where he says, do or do not, there is no try. And he goes on and he talks about Teshu and Yoshiaki, and then he finishes the chapter with his final paragraph where he says, axiomatic to Zen philosophy is the insight that conceptual understanding is illusory. A core assumption of Western thought is that one can use intellect to understand mind and reality. Zen asserts that this is not the case. True understanding is beyond all conceptualization. The mind is endlessly active in effort to achieve that which is impossible for it. Zen is a philosophy to undo philosophy, to study mind and reality with no mind. There is no end to asking why and no way to give an intellectual answer that will be fully satisfactory. When Luke asks the why question, Yoda answers, no, there is no why. Nothing more will I teach you today. Clear your mind of questions. So that's his final paragraph of the chapter. So I found this a really fascinating chapter. I think it's really cool, especially to hear his observations about the specific influences that were consciously used in the Star Wars films, such as the name of the Jedi and the use of Eastern swordplay techniques, etc. I think what I found most interesting in this chapter was the observation that George Lucas was heavily influenced by Joseph Campbell and Campbell's particular archetypal way of interpreting myth, so that, as Robinson puts it, Star Wars mythology is an intentional expression of archetypal truth. Which makes a lot of sense because Star Wars does end up having kind of a mythological feel to it. And I think it could be argued that Star Wars is kind of the closest thing we have in modern America to a broadly shared mythology, particularly now that the Lord of the Rings saga is waning in popularity. Now, the fact that it aspires to be archetypal doesn't mean that it actually is this kind of even-handed balance of all global mythology or the root of global mythology, if such a thing could even be discovered. The story is clearly a Zen Buddhist interpretation for the most part, I think. But I think that the Campbell reference is interesting because it shows that Lucas wasn't merely aiming to syncretize or to blend concepts for commercial success, let's say, but he was actually aiming to create a timeless story that gets at the core of humanity and speaks the language of myth in a modern Western, but also a multicultural, global kind of way. Anyway, so in conclusion, this has been a fascinating chapter from my point of view. Definitely pick it up and give it a read if you find this kind of thing interesting. I think it shows some really interesting ways that Eastern philosophy and culture played a shaping role on the storytelling and world building of Star Wars. For myself, I'm looking forward to keeping on researching and exploring in various ways the background and influence of the Star Wars films. And especially I'm interested in the impact that they have on our culture and society as, like I said, is kind of one of the few nearly universal American visual myths that such a vast majority of Americans are familiar with. It's kind of a story that we all know in common together, and that speaks in a mythological kind of way. Anyway, up next from my last video in this short series here, I plan to discuss and provide a short summary and review and discussion of the 4th chapter in the book, which is about the philosophical messages relating to morality and ethics within the classic Star Wars films. I found that to be a really fascinating chapter as well. And then I think these 4 taken together, I think these 4 chapters provide a really interesting scope of ideas to sum up some of the most thought-provoking standout themes and elements in the classic films. So I've really enjoyed all 4, and I'm looking forward to discussing that 4th one. All right, thanks for sticking around to the end of the video here, and I will see you in the next one.